A landing was made this morning on the coast of France by troops of the Allied Expeditionary Force. This landing is but the opening phase of the campaign in Western Europe.
On one memorable day, the Allies thrust over 100,000 troops across the English Channel to establish a shallow but firm foothold on the European continent. As June 7th dawned, the Allies faced a new task: expand the beachhead and push inland toward the ultimate goal, the frontiers of the Third Reich itself. For all the planning, all the material, manpower, ships, and aircraft that went into the D-Day landings, the invasion of France succeeded only in establishing the Allies ashore. The Allies' objectives, for the most part, had not been attained. This was particularly true in the British sectors. The combination of the congestion on the beaches and the failure to push inland fast enough on D-Day proved devastating to the original plan to have Caen by the evening of the first day ashore. In the American sector, the GIs, clinging to their shallow beachheads, realized and linking all the Allied beaches together became the main priority on D+1.
On D+1, Field Marshal Montgomery, the ground forces commander, arrived off the Normandy beaches to have a conference with his two army commanders. He urged them to quickly consolidate their beaches, link up, and push inland aggressively. Particularly, he was disappointed in the British failure to take Caen the first day of the operation. He needed to take Caen to break out into the open country to be able to get his mass of armor engaged in open terrain to take on the German reserves rapidly approaching the coast.
With strong German units only a few miles from the beaches, the possibility of a counterattack that would push the Allies back to the water's edge remained a major threat.
Even though officially we might have said the beaches were cleared, the resistance was still coming from behind the beaches. A lot of that was from artillery pieces, and that was going on into the D+2 and beyond. Then we had some machine gun fire that was still covering the beaches. We had sniper fire that went on into D2, D3, and it was very effective as far as the Germans were concerned, because they not only were able to create some damage by their own sniper fire, but more particularly, they were able to keep our troops on edge.
We were in tents on the beach, actually not literally on the beach, but in the dunes just inland from the beach, because the beach was too big a target. There were already enough arriving troops there that we didn't want to add more of us to there. And during that time, our unit did suffer some casualties from landmines as well as regular air raids.
Nevertheless, with more troops and equipment landing every hour, Allied power on the continent swelled. The units already ashore pushed inland after the original D-Day objectives that had not yet been taken. Progress proved maddeningly slow, as the GIs were hampered by the fierce German resistance and the unique terrain of Normandy.
The fields in Normandy are surrounded by hedges that grow on top of earthen walls. The earthen walls themselves are almost impenetrable. It's really tough to get through this stuff. And the hedges are very thick. The effect on combat is to really compartmentalize combat into these small single-cell fields. Every time you go into a field, you never know what you're up against. There could be a machine gun on the other side of it, and I think to U.S. infantry in the Bocage, it seemed like there always was.
The 4th Infantry Division made slow progress through the difficult terrain. They had already linked up with the paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne behind Utah Beach late on the 6th. So now the division turned and began to move from the area around Sainte-Mère-Église and Utah Beach toward Cherbourg, the vital port at the end of the Cotentin Peninsula. Its capture was a high priority for the Allied planners.
The Allied forces in general desperately wanted a good port The Omaha beaches are not ports. They're simply open beaches. Cherbourg was the only major port that seemed within reach, and so the U.S. Army's mission was to go up and seize Cherbourg.
On the left of the American toehold in Normandy, things were worse behind Omaha, as the 1st Infantry Division, seeking to link up with the British to their left, advanced slowly toward Bayeux. At the same time, the 29th Division pushed the other direction toward the town of Isigny, as they headed for Carentan and a link-up with the airborne and the Utah beachhead. It was slow going, and the Americans fell further behind the pre-invasion schedule.
The villages like Carentan and some of the others inland from Omaha were a lot tougher. First of all, the drops were scattered, and secondly, they didn't get as many troops off Omaha Beach on the first day.
I had occasion to go to what was then the 5th Corps headquarters, which was on the upper part of the bluff, and they had dug some trenches, and here's General Giroux down in the trench, you know, and that was his CP, and so even as I said, at that point, when you would have expected that, according to plan, he would have been maybe 6 or 8 miles inland, he was still right there.
To make matters worse for the Allies, aerial reconnaissance showed more German armor moving toward Caen. Though the German High Command still believed that another landing would take place at Calais, much of the Panzer Reserve was released to contain the Normandy lodgment. For the German panzer units, the passage through France to the front lines became a nightmare. Moving by rail or road in daylight attracted Allied fighter bombers, whose bombs and rockets destroyed vehicles and slowed movement. One German commander...
A real impact on the battlefield was in the interdiction of German soft-skinned transport vehicles and troops out in the open.
A lot of traffic we had to shoot up would be teams of horses pulling wagons of ammunition and so on, and covered with straw at the back. It looked like a farmer's hay wagon. Germans were experts on camouflage. They had to be, because we pretty well, by the time the Normandy invasion was on, we had control of the air. So to move stuff on the ground, they had to hide it pretty well. And they were quite good at it. Any, dispatch riders or jeeps, anything like that, they'd be racing along a French road, and if they'd have one guy sitting riding backwards in the motor vehicle, watching the air. And if he saw any of us up there, he'd signal to the driver, and they'd duck under the nearest tree or bridge or whatever.
As well as Allied air attack, German efforts to reinforce and resupply the defenders of Normandy also faced harassment from the French resistance.
The Americans had considerable success in France with the resistance through the Jedburgh program, which infiltrated joint teams of American, British, and French experts to liaise and support with local resistance groups throughout the country.
We would then train these people as guerrillas and eventually lead them, in many cases, in attacks against German installations, against German movements, either road movements or rail movements, cut the railroads and the roads as ordered by London.
They were interested in doing anything that was possible to slow down that unit from getting up to reinforce the German troops that were up to defend the Normandy invasion area.
Despite the risks, the Germans continued to put badly needed reinforcements on the roads of Normandy. While the reserves were struggling to even get into the battle, two of the most powerful German units in Normandy had already engaged the British around Caen. The 21st Panzer Division and the 12th SS Hitler Youth Divisions worked together to halt all British efforts to take the vital city. Meanwhile, the British moving inland from Gold Beach cut the Caen Bayou Road. The next day, the British captured Bayeux itself.
But there weren't very many civilians around, except in Bayeux, which was captured and wasn't damaged.
Allied troops stood by as French civilians beat and humiliated their fellow citizens who had collaborated with the Nazis, while doing their best to protect German prisoners of war.
The hardest part of our time, the first few days, was disarming the French people. Because they would grab these rifles or whatever it was, and they would indiscriminately just shoot the Germans. They were, had been under German rule, and they wanted to retaliate, and you couldn't really blame them. But again, the Geneva Conference didn't go for that. A lot of it was, we just forgot about it too.
By D+3, the Americans and British had linked up near Bayeux, giving the Allies a little bit of maneuvering room. On the far right, the American 7th Corps, along with the 82nd Airborne Division, were starting to cut off the base of the Cotentin Peninsula in preparation for the drive on Cherbourg. The 101st Airborne remained in the line to help capture Carentan. The Germans realized how important this crossroad town was to the Allies and reinforced the defenders. The 101st Airborne fought all day, taking heavy casualties with little success.
We were moving up to Carentan, going along a railroad track, and you could see over the top out there the area we were going to attack. And there was a row of walking wounded coming back.
The next day, the paratroopers attacked the town from two directions and began to make progress. On June 12th, the Germans, who were low on ammunition, were forced to retreat, and Carentan fell to the tired GIs of the 101st Airborne and 29th Infantry Divisions. The American beachheads were finally linked. The lodgment in Normandy was now nearly 10 miles deep and about 60 miles wide. General Eisenhower came ashore on an inspection trip and felt the beachhead was finally secure.
So we moved on out through Carentan to an area beyond the city, I don't know how far, but in the hedgerows, and set up defense along there. And we were in that area, I don't know, some days.
While the Americans battled their way into Carentan, the British went after Caen. Operation Perch, a two-pronged thrust against the city, was launched on June 10th.
When the British failed to take Caen on D-Day, Montgomery had to go back to the drawing board and conceive of another offensive operation to take this vital city. And that's exactly what Operation Perch was designed to do.
The British would initially face more skilled, combat-effective German units than the Americans would. The Americans would spend the initial time fighting against static divisions that, for the most part, had no combat experience, that were composed significantly of forced conscriptees. But the British would soon face German Waffen-SS, Panzer Grenadier divisions, highly motivated, very well equipped, very well trained, combat experience. They would face them initially because as those units began to feed into the battle area, they would come in through the road network leading to Caen, and then, just by matter of proximity, they would encounter the British first. But then also, the topography in that area tended to favor the rapid movement of vehicular traffic.
Perch quickly unraveled. One prong of the offensive, spearheaded by the veteran 51st Highlander Division, smashed itself against the 21st Panzer and made no progress at all. To the west, the second prong of the offensive, led by the 7th Armored Division, looked promising at first.
The 7th Armored Division penetrated some 12 miles to this small town, Villers-Bocage, and were actually taking up positions in the town when the Germans reacted rather violently to this incursion, for want of a better way of putting it. And the battle raged for 2 days. The 4th County London Yeomanry, being the leading regiment, suffered rather badly.
The panzers, combat veterans of the Russian front, tore the leading brigade apart. The Germans concluded that for the moment, Caen was safe. Rommel wanted to take advantage of the situation and counterattack the Americans while the British regrouped after the failure of Perch. But he had no reserves to throw into such an operation. In fact, his units were already stretched to the limit.
Rommel had stopped the British outside of Caen by using his available strategic reserves and putting them in the line. But what that did was it prevented Rommel from counterattacking the American drive at St. Lo with enough force to blunt that operation. He simply didn't have the available troops to put in the line over there and throw into that fray. Part of the problem was that American and British aircraft are interdicting his communication lines, and this becomes a dynamic throughout the entire Normandy campaign where Rommel is just short-handed. He doesn't have the troops needed to create a mobile reserve that can then strike back and deal devastating blows to the Allies.
There would be no counterattack against the Americans, who by now were pushing ever closer toward Cherbourg while driving on the road junction at Saint-Lô. While the Americans drove on Saint-Lô, the Germans were beginning the V1 attacks against England. The English had thought they were safe from another blitz, and the random strikes by the pilotless flying bombs struck a sharp blow at British morale.
The resumption of the V1s really were just too much, because the stoicism and courage which the Londoners had shown in face of the air raids a few years before, now they felt this time they knew that Hitler was going to lose the war. It was just too much to face the V1s, and then pretty soon the V2s, which were like cruise missiles.
Resources had to be diverted to defend against this new menace. Anti-aircraft guns were redeployed to the coast, and squadrons of fighters were diverted to air defense in an effort to stop the deadly doodlebugs, as they were nicknamed. Although these efforts succeeded in bringing down nearly a third of the incoming bombs, it became a matter of urgency for the Allies to break out of the beachhead and seize the V1 launching sites along the French, Belgian, and Dutch coast. As the drive inland took shape, the weather improved enough to allow the Allies to land huge quantities of men and supplies across the beaches. In the ports of England, waves of men and material were loaded into transports and shipped over to build and broaden the toehold on the continent.
They laid a phone cable right across the ocean as they went across. We called Normandy Beach, telling them what material was coming over the next day, and they would send us an SOS and saying we need tanks and we need this immediately, you know. And so we would try to send over what they needed.
This monumental effort helped the Allies keep the pressure on the Germans. Nevertheless, supplying the armies without a port was a difficult job.
If you want to know what it was like, if you saw the motion picture of Private Ryan, it was a lot like that. There were still bodies in the water, and we could see all kinds of debris from the invasion, and we really admired, you couldn't help but admire what those guys must have gone through, trying to hide behind anti-tank barriers and so on to move in on the coast.
They had not had time to remove bodies from the day before, or all of them. There were all sorts of deterrents to getting to the beach easily. The amount of foot traffic and the amount of confusion, you wonder how it could possibly all work out right.
The first thing that I was encountered with after getting the first troops across was an effort to try to clear the beach of the obstacles that were there so that the following boats and soldiers and equipment could come in more readily.
The Germans had taken railroad tracks in maybe 5 or 6 feet length and welded them together so they looked like big jacks that would impale land craft. We had to dynamite those out and try to clear those away.
Allied ability to push supplies across the Channel barrier was already outdistancing their ability to get the needed supplies ashore. By D+2, they were already 50% behind the scheduled buildup of supplies. Something needed to change.
The LSTs could come right into the beach and did, and would bring them in at high tide, unload the tanks or whatever from them directly. Then they would have to sit there then until the next high tide in order to be able to go back out. You know, when we could do that and plan it that way, it was quite effective. Traffic control became more a matter of controlling the landing craft, where they landed and when they landed, than it did of controlling the traffic over the beach itself.
Beaching the vessels between tides helped the movement of supplies to catch up with the planned schedule. Stocks of ammunition and rations slowly took shape. Despite the improvement in delivery, the success of the entire operation depended on maintaining the scheduled buildup. Until a port could be captured, the Allied armies would need to be supplied over the beaches.
Every military operation depends on logistics, or the ability to move the fuel and the ammunition and the food to the troops so that they can continue combat operations. Well, when you're doing an amphibious landing, you throw in an additional barrier or problem for the logisticians, in that you show up off the beach with all these supplies. Now, how do you get them ashore? How do you bridge that gap between the ships and the land? Well, the Allies have a lot of experience, and they've been able to fight this problem off in a lot of different ways. For instance, you bring LSTs ashore with loaded trucks and move them in. You have amphibious vehicles that can go out to the ships, load supplies on them, and bring them ashore. You've developed barges and things like this, but that problem is going from the ship across this gap of water to the shore, crossing a beach that isn't always easy to cross, and getting those supplies into the supply dumps so that the supply organization and system can begin to operate.
To solve this problem, the Allies undertook the construction of artificial harbors on the coast of Normandy. Known as mulberries, these man-made harbors were a marvel of engineering.
Those got constructed in very short order and were very well conceived and very well executed in terms of bringing in the concrete caissons early on, sinking them to form a breakwater, sinking the old ships to form breakwaters, and then to bring in the pontoon constructed units to form the platforms for the ships to come up and dock against inside of a sheltered water, and then the causeways from those pontoon dock areas into the shore.
The Normandy beach began to hum with action. By D+12, almost 600,000 men and 90,000 vehicles had come ashore, ready for the drive inland. Then, just as the artificial ports were completed, the fickle weather turned foul.
We had just gotten hours into operation, and it was looking like, boy, it was going to be great when the storm came along. At about D+12, I guess, the storm came through and just devastated everything. It not only flipped a lot of landing craft, but it tore up our causeways to our artificial dock landing area. And it also really disturbed some of the breakwater ships and concrete caissons. We made a basic decision. Let's just don't worry about trying to depend on this. Rebuilding. Let's continue to do what we can do. and that was to unload directly over the beaches, the LSTs, and so on. We really were able to overcome the disadvantage of having our artificial harbor destroyed. We began to get a flow of German prisoners, too, on about D+3.
We would then have them on pins, barbed wire enclosures on the beach until we'd get them on landing craft and ship them to England.
Working almost side by side with the supply people, Allied medical personnel struggled to patch the wounded up and get them in shape for the harsh trip back across the channel.
About 2 days after the invasion, hospital ships came in and we would unload the wounded onto hospital trains, and they would send them to the different hospitals in England.
Of course, we had medical detachments that were ashore early on, right with the combat troops. And they were very active from the very beginning. Larger medical units began to come ashore, I would say, about D+5 or 6.
We sort of set up a hospital. Our hospital consisted of a tent and 6 nurses, 3 work days, 3 work nights, and 3 officers. But we worked 12-hour shifts. We only took care of open bellies and open lungs. Anything else was sent back. It made no difference whether they were German soldiers, whether they were American soldiers. We worked with anybody who was brought in.
You get really distressed at seeing young men die. That's the one thing that I recall, because a lot of them did die, you know, they didn't recover from their wounds.
On the German front, commanders took little comfort in the fact that so far their men had contained the beachhead and prevented a breakout. They looked across the lines and saw the tremendous flow of men and material coming in from England and concluded that they would not be able to hold the Allies back much longer. On June 17th, as the Americans made the final push to cut off the base of the Cotentin Peninsula, Adolf Hitler met with his commanders in Soissons.
As Hitler meets with his generals at Soissons, both von Rundstedt and Rommel are increasingly emphatic about their desire to withdraw from Normandy to better defensive positions along the Seine River. And of course, Hitler's not interested in any kind of withdrawal. Well, as the day progresses and as the discussions go on, the generals become increasingly blunt. And finally, Rommel says that the war is lost and that Germany should end it.
Hitler told his generals to stand and fight in Normandy. He felt confident his long-awaited wonder weapons, jet fighters, V-1 and V-2 rockets, would turn the tide against the Allies. The V-1s and V-2s needed launch facilities as near London as possible, and a withdrawal from Normandy would threaten those sites. But Hitler's wonder weapons, especially his promised jet aircraft, failed to materialize in strength. This forced the Luftwaffe to do what it could to harass the Allied beachheads and slow the buildup.
The Luftwaffe made token raids on the beaches. And I say token, usually it was maybe 2 or 3 planes. They were very ineffective.
It just become dark first night, moonlight, bombers coming over low, so low you could see the pilots very clearly. And we had drawn a greenhorn ack outfit. And they just couldn't resist trying to shoot down one of those bombers.
Never much more than a nuisance, the raids often cost the German Air Force dearly. These were resources they could not afford to lose.
The plane was on its way down, and it went over my little tree where I was, close enough that I could see the faces of the crew on the plane, and then it crashed about a quarter of a mile up the hill from where I went.
I impacted, I still hear that miserable crash and sit in that plane, and I just ducked, had cut everything, and the plane, with one part of the wing shot off, slid sideways, and then I glanced up and I saw some trees coming to me, and I have a little cut here, and I hit the instrument pen. I shouldn't have looked up, I should have covered my face.
While the Luftwaffe suffered from shortages of everything from pilots to fuel, Allied aircraft controlled the skies over Normandy. This control made possible the use of small, unarmed observation planes called Piper L-4 Grasshoppers. These small planes provided an invaluable service spotting German strong points on the advance toward Cherbourg. While the L-4s could operate from small pastures and grassy fields, the Allies needed more permanent airfields so the fighter bombers could move to the continent. By mid-June, Allied engineers had built several airfields that could handle the larger planes.
They take stereoscopic pictures from photo reconnaissance, long before the invasion, all along the French coast. And then they can tell with their stereoscopes what looks like a level field, what is a potential landing ground. And they have them all marked out to get bulldozers, and they go in as early as they can, put a bulldozer in and level this farmer's grain down to make an airstrip.
The fighter bombers served as flying artillery for the ground troops. Long before D-Day, the Allies had integrated forward air controllers into frontline units. These men called in airstrikes wherever they were needed.
In Normandy, a lot of the forward air controllers were themselves pilots. They were doing a month-long stint with an armored unit to understand what it was like at the sharp end. And then they would go back to their attack air units with a better appreciation for what it took for air ground support.
The tank column will hold up for you to make another pass.
If we thought we couldn't cope with it, then we'd call in the Typhoons, and the RAF observation officer would give the position, map reference, and then they would come and they would take it out.
With air operations going well, the British launched their second major offensive against Caen on June 25th. Dubbed Operation Epsom, the British and Canadians again found themselves battling the cream of the German army. They suffered a bloody repulse. A combination of excellent defensive terrain and high-quality weapons and training allowed the Germans to inflict serious losses on the Allies. However, massive Allied air support and firepower, along with steady buildup of Allied ground strength, had convinced the German field commanders they were in a battle of attrition that they could not win. But all was not yet lost for Germany.
The American forces advancing on St. Lo and the port of Cherbourg are hampered by a shortage of artillery ammunition, which was caused by the Channel storm. Now, in addition to interfering with the Allied logistical effort, the Channel storm also gave the Germans about 4 days of uninterrupted reinforcement and resupply, because the Allied fighter bombers couldn't interfere with them because of the storm. Well, the combination of this input of German resources and the slowdown of Allied logistical buildup means that the Americans will be forced into this bloody yard-by-yard fight in the hedgerows.
Since D+1, the Americans in Normandy had found themselves mired in a labyrinth of sunken roads and thick hedgerows, tailor-made for the German defenders.
They would face a significant obstacle fighting from hedgerow to hedgerow. These were obstacles that the Germans would be in a position to use to their great advantage.
And then suddenly it was, oh my, this whole new tactical problem, which the American Army solved very quickly, but it was a bloody solution. And the learning process was a lot more expensive than it should have been.
Advances were judged in yards, not in miles, much like World War I. and every yard gained came with a bloody cost.
Sometimes it was a whole day's battle just to get across one field, then you might lose it that night.
So we didn't move very much. You tried to move down roads, and if you had tanks, you could go behind a tank down a road with hedgerows on both sides. But you can see the difficulty there. You're exposed again, and the enemy could just come right over the top of the hedgerow and knock you right off. How we fought in those, it was very difficult. We would try to find a spot where maybe there wasn't any resistance. And to do this, you had to expose yourself. In the infantry, platoon and company, you have scouts and so on that you send out. It was an awful lot to ask a guy to say, okay, I want you to go and scout out this next hedgerow, because the chances of him coming back were very slim.
You couldn't tell what you were going to run into, you know, because a lot of times it was just face to face, because you'd go out the hedgerow and there'd be some German standing there with a machine gun or something, pointing right at you, because he'd hear you coming through the hedgerow.
I could hear Germans yakking on the other side of this other hedgerow, and I threw a couple potato mashers over there, German potato mashers. Whether it did anything or not, I have no idea, but I just did it for harassment, if nothing else. But anyway, I didn't hear any yakking anymore.
As the campaign wore on, the Germans reinforced their frontline troops with higher quality infantry units.
In the hedgerows, we were against the top-notch Germans. You know, they came out of Africa, Russia, and they were the elite soldiers.
The fighting in the Bocage degenerated into a company commander's war, characterized by thousands of brutal small unit actions.
The Bocage put an emphasis on small unit light infantry tactics.
Both armies were very good at taking advantage very quickly of an enemy weak spot because the initiative was taken right at the level it was there on the spot. Might have trouble following up on it, and that depended on how fast the enemy reacted. But they were both dangerous armies to fight because if you made a mistake, they could exploit it.
Eventually we came to a hedgerow, and we were fired upon from the hedgerow, so we turned the fire and dashed over to it. And there were some foxholes on this side of the hedgerow. Some Germans popped out of that, surrendered, and the others were on the other side of it. I remember one of the guys went down the hedgerow and stuck his gun through to look for something, and the German grabbed the gun and pulled it from his arms and shot him. And I remember also one of the privates asking the lieutenant, what should we do with these prisoners? And he said, take them over there and shoot them. I don't know if that happened or not, but out of the corner of my eye, I saw a gap in the hedgerow. The Germans were running past on the other side. So I ran out in the middle of the field, and as they came through that gap, I started picking them off. I don't know how many that was my second human being to kill, which I wouldn't ever brag about. But I don't know how many I had shot before some sniper got me, hit me right here, and I don't even remember being hit, but I do remember lying on my back and seeing the clouds go by, and I was just kind of in dreamland until the pain came.
The American Army had learned in North Africa and Sicily to rely on mobile fire support and close cooperation between infantry and armor. The hedgerows of the Bocage country made tank movement dangerous and coordination between infantry and armor nearly impossible.
Because when they would hit that hedgerow, they would bring them up like this, exposing a soft belly.
Well, Germans learned that, so they just waited till you got up here and boom, right into the belly of the tank. And we lost an awful lot of them, so that's when they came up with these forks that would shove that out. Then the infantry could come right in through. They didn't have to climb over or anything like that. The mediums would just move the whole thing. And so the Germans on the other side, all they would see is this big mass of dirt coming with trees and shrubs and everything on it up above it. They worked real well.
Solving the problem of getting tanks through the hedgerows didn't immediately open things up for the American units struggling through the rough terrain. In almost every row were hidden small German combat teams and machine gunners who were in perfect position to fight the U.S. infantry as they pushed their way forward.
A lot of time, it was just hand-to-hand combat right there, right in that hedgerow.
There was times when the Germans would be just on the other side of the hedgerow from us. One night I was digging a slit trench on my side of this hedgerow, and I laid my trench shovel up on the top of the hedgerow, and when I reached up to use it again, it wasn't my trench shovel, it was a folding type that the Germans used. So I didn't sleep that night.
While the advance on Saint-Lô crawled forward, General Collins and his 7th Corps pressed up the Cotentin Peninsula, pushing the Germans into the fortress around Cherbourg.
Cherbourg itself was protected by a fortified ring around it, partly an older French defensive ring, but also reinforced by the Germans in 1943-44. So the battle for Cherbourg ended up being a fight against very heavily defended positions. But on the other hand, the U.S. Army did succeed fairly rapidly in cutting off the city from any further reinforcement. So it was something of a foregone conclusion, although the U.S. Army was able to capture Cherbourg much faster than Hitler or most of the Germans thought would be possible.
Cherbourg fell on June 27th. Ordered by Hitler to defend the city to the last man, Major General Karl von Schlieben finally surrendered, reasoning that further sacrifice would make no difference. With the fall of Cherbourg came 45,000 German prisoners. It was the biggest Allied success since D-Day. Yet the port of Cherbourg itself would contribute nothing to the Allied cause for weeks to come.
The Germans had sunk a lot of ships in it to make it unusable, and we had to dynamite or try to cut up ships to get so that the docks, the piers, were available.
We'd work about 24 hours a day, had our own air cover. Our job was to clear out the debris and fix up part of the pier so that ships could come in. They said, that's the only thing you're worried about, just make sure that it's cleared out away from the pier and so that they can get in.
For 3 weeks, the fighting in Normandy had raged without pause. Thousands of men on both sides had been killed in a struggle for a few miles of French soil. With little room to maneuver, the Allies were forced to bludgeon their way ahead, counting on attrition to finally weaken the defenders. Meanwhile, far to the east, the Russians unleashed an entirely different battle, one that would drastically affect the success of Allied operations in Normandy. As the Allied forces struggled to break out of the Normandy beachhead, the Germans on the Eastern Front were trying desperately to hold the Russians away from the Reich. 3 years earlier, the Germans were poised to conquer the world as they swept into Russia in June of 1941. But the Red Army had slowed and then stopped the Nazi tide. They had fought back and inflicted heavy casualties on the Germans at battles like Stalingrad and Kursk. Now, on June 22, 1944, the third anniversary of the invasion, the Soviets were poised for a massive offensive.
A lot of people in the West who are aware of World War II know about D-Day and the landings at Normandy, but a lot of people don't realize that at the same time this is happening, in June of 1944, on the Eastern Front, the German army is going to suffer the greatest single disaster of the entire war. They'd already suffered Stalingrad, they'd suffered other defeats, we'd captured a large number of Germans in North Africa, but in June of 44, on the Eastern Front, the Soviets launched the greatest offensive they'd ever launched up to that point, called Operation Bagration, where it destroyed 30 German divisions. 300,000 Germans were either killed, wounded, or captured. The entire guts of the center of the line of the German East Front was gone, and the Russians poured through it and made it all the way to Poland and East Prussia.
Operation Bagration was only the beginning. As soon as German panzer reserves began to move north to oppose the drive into Belorussia, the Soviets struck out of the Ukraine into southern Poland, and then another drive was launched that took Romania out of the war and swept through Bulgaria and into Yugoslavia.
And this is all going on at a time that they have to contend with the Allied landings in Normandy, and they have to switch forces there because they can't ignore it. So this was a tremendous blow to Germany in terms of its war effort, and it also meant that we weren't going to face a lot of divisions coming to Normandy because the Germans simply didn't have the units anymore.
Finally caught in a real two-front war, the 1,000-year Reich had in fact 11 months left to live. Despite being stuck in the bocage and way behind schedule, one part of the Allied scheme was succeeding beyond their wildest hopes. The deception plan that gave the appearance of threatening the Pas-de-Calais was still confusing the Germans, even in July. And so while some reserves flowed into Normandy, the 15th Army was still defending the northern coast of France. Allied aircraft continued to decimate German reinforcements sent to the Normandy front. The handwriting was on the wall, and most of the German commanders could see it. The Allies were winning the Battle of the Buildup in Normandy. From his headquarters in Paris, Field Marshal von Rundstedt had described the situation to his superiors in Germany. When asked what he thought should be done, he had thundered, "Make peace, you fools!" An infuriated Hitler replaced von Rundstedt with Field Marshal Gunther von Klug, who vowed his commitment to the unconditional holding of the present defense line. Despite winning the Battle of the Buildup, 3 weeks after the invasion, the Allies had only secured a beachhead. The Allied plan had envisioned the seizure of Normandy as a base, the opening of the port of Cherbourg, and with a firm base established, an advance first to the Seine, then to the German border. The greatest single disappointment of the invasion had been the inability to take Caen, which blocked the approaches to the Seine. The British troops attempting to capture this city had been held off, giving the Germans time to rush in heavy reinforcements, and subsequent attacks had been stopped. It was in this sector that the most open terrain beckoned, and it was also this end of the Allied line that was closest to Paris. As a result, 10 of the 12 Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions that converged on Normandy were concentrated here, facing the British. On the 1st of July, Rommel launched a counteroffensive against the British around Caen. Elements of 5 Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions were driven back by the British, but only after concentrated artillery and naval gunfire was unleashed on them. It was the heaviest fighting since D-Day. Following this German counterattack, General Montgomery was determined to take Caen once and for all. After bombing reduced the town to rubble, Caen fell to the British in early July. However, German panzers continued to hold on in the southern outskirts of the city, preventing the British from breaking out into the open country beyond.
Shortly after the fall of Caen, Rommel is actually injured in a car wreck caused by a couple of strafing Spitfires. Because of this, Field Marshal Gunther von Klug takes over Rommel's command, and this actually unifies the German command structure on the Western Front for the first time.
The next day, following another round of heavy RAF bombing, the British attempted to break through German Panzer Group West with Operation Goodwood. 3 armored divisions mounted the attack and were initially successful, but German 88mm guns on a nearby ridge drew them back, effectively stalling British efforts to break out from Caen. The same day Goodwood opened around Caen, the U.S. 29th Infantry Division that had been so bloodied at Omaha Beach battered its way into Saint-Lô.
When we went on down into St. Lo, it was just pure rubble. They just flattened everything in there.
The rubble was piled high, and you could hardly find a street where you could go down straight. You had to weave back and forth. We didn't see a living thing.
Very few buildings left, and most of them were torn down. They just bulldozed streets through.
The capture of Saint-Lô was a major loss for the Germans because it gave the Americans access to roads leading south. This strained the ring of Nazi defenses around the beachhead. A few more pushes, and it might break open. By the 20th of July, the German situation in Normandy had grown precarious. The British held Caen, and the Americans were in Saint-Lô, poised to push through the bocage and into open country. Far from Normandy, the frustration of the German military hierarchy led to a desperate act that electrified the world and revealed that there was dissension within the enemy camp. At the Wolf's Lair, a planted bomb had demolished Hitler's map room, but the attempt to assassinate Hitler had failed. Retribution against the plotters was swift. Even as Hitler visited the mangled survivors, Nazi secret police, or Gestapo, were exterminating almost 5,000 suspects.
Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was implicated in this plot to kill Hitler, and he's one of the victims of the roundup of the conspirators by the secret police. But because of his status as a war hero in Germany, he's given the option of committing suicide rather than face an embarrassment or the embarrassment of a state trial. So he commits suicide, and he's given this very lavish state funeral, which is presided over by Adolf Hitler, the very leader in whom he had lost faith.
Hitler's command style became even more self-centered, even more unwilling to look to outside advice. So the war continued to be fought from East Prussia, and Hitler's direct intervention became more frequent and less beneficial to the German war effort.
The abortive coup had little effect on the military situation in Normandy. There was no widespread uprising against Nazi rule among the armed forces. The combat soldier was too busy simply trying to stay alive. However, it was becoming increasingly clear to the German commanders in the field that their ability to hold the line was almost at an end. Von Klug, writing to Adolf Hitler, "In spite of intense efforts, the moment has drawn near when this front, already so heavily strained, will break. And once the enemy is in open country, an orderly command will hardly be practicable in view of the insufficient mobility of our troops. I consider it my duty to bring these conclusions to your notice, my Fuhrer, in good time." On July 24th, the Americans attempted a major breakthrough just west of Saint-Lô called Operation Cobra.
And the aim of Operation Cobra is for the U.S. Army to get out of this hedgerow country and to break out into the open country where they can take advantage of their mechanized forces.
Once again, the Allies planned a massive bombing strike to crush the German line. The force of Allied aircraft was to lay a carpet of high explosives to open the attack. But heavy overcast over the target forced a decision to abort the strike, and the attack was put off a day. Unfortunately, some bombers didn't get the word and bombed through the clouds, killing and wounding many Americans. For General Bradley, an immediate and urgent decision had to be made. The prospects were improving for good weather the next day. Should Cobra be launched even in the face of the possibility that the Americans had now lost the important element of tactical surprise, or should it be postponed, which might then give the Germans a chance to prepare even stronger defenses? Bradley's decision was that Cobra would strike at 11 o'clock the next day. Again, on the morning of July 25th, planes came. One observer called the seemingly endless waves of planes the most imposing aerial parade I've seen since the beginning of this long war.
The sky actually looked like it was black. We didn't think there was that many airplanes in the world.
Boy, I mean, the trees were shaking, the ground, man, it was you could hardly stand up like being on a boat.
Gradually, the torrents of exploding bombs began easing back toward the Allied line. The bombardiers' view of the ground was obscured by the smoke and dust of the explosions, and a gentle breeze had sent the cloud drifting back over the American lines, and for the second time in 2 days, Allied bombs fell on Americans.
It got so cloudy and dusty and so much smoke and stuff, and it was drifting toward us, and the bombers got so they were just dropping on the cloud, figuring it was over there, and the first thing then we knew we were getting ready to take off, why they bombed the end of our runway.
We got word that General McNair had gotten killed by bombing, but it was hard for anybody apparently to establish where all the troops were.
In all, the air armada dropped more than 4,000 tons of destruction, but the tactical effect on the Germans was not immediately known.
Commander of the Panzer Division sent back a communique that it looks like the moon escaped. They just turned everything over. And he said it didn't matter what the quality of the troops, didn't matter if they were first-line troops or reservists, that it had the same effect upon them. It just turned them and shocked them to that they couldn't stand it.
Without waiting for the smoke to clear, Allied ground troops moved out at once toward their immediate objectives, Marigny and Saint-Gilles. Capture of those towns would give the Americans control of the roads leading south and the open ground beyond.
They started forming task force, like Task Force Weaver, Task Force Randolph, and they'd put us in the light tanks out in front, and we'd run.
Both towns were holding out by the end of the first day, and resistance, even after the bombing, was remarkably tough. But it was not continuous. General Collins, commanding 7th Corps, could determine that there were gaps in the German lines, and this is something that had not been seen before. But what did it mean? He wasn't sure. Could it be the Germans had left strong rear guards to cover a withdrawal? Could it mean this was just an outpost line and the main line of resistance was somewhere deeper, still untouched? Or could it be this was all the Germans had left? He had a serious decision to make for the next day.
Because the entire success of Cobra depended on a 7th Corps breakthrough, Collins decided to gamble. It would prove to be one of the most fateful decisions of the campaign. Collins committed his armor to the breakthrough. The masters of the Blitzkrieg were about to be shown what the Americans had learned about mobile warfare in North Africa and Sicily.
The American armored forces were task organized into these fast mobile columns with combined arms. They had infantry and engineers, rhino tanks, and things to help them through the last little bit of the bocage to break out into open ground. Also, overhead of the columns would be Allied fighter bombers who were being controlled by forward air controllers with the armored columns themselves.
We'd run into resistance or anything like that. Then they'd pull us back, and we would get around, and away we'd go again.
The American tanks were in many ways inferior to the German panzers. However, these disadvantages were made up for by sheer numbers, innovative tactics, and one key technological edge.
We had full control, power control on the turret. The Germans had to wind theirs, which was an advantage to us because if we could maneuver, we could get around and get to the side of them.
A German tank officer captured by the Americans is said to have sneered at his captors. One of my tanks is as good as 10 of your tanks. And the Americans sneered back, too bad we had 11 tanks. So a lot of the American capability in terms of armor was sheer numbers.
If the Third Army had had Panthers instead of Shermans, they'd have never made it to Germany in the time they did, because they'd have just left all their Panthers strung out, broken down across northern France. The United States Army went from Normandy to Germany and won the war, and did it with the Sherman tank, and there's really no other tank they could have done it with.
The old Sherman, one of the best things about it, you know, you could pull that engine, replace it, and have it back in action. It'd have 5 holes in it, and they'd put it back in action.
Collins' gamble paid off big. In mid-afternoon of the 26th, one armored column of the 2nd Armored Division cracked the enemy's defenses around the town and rolled through Saint-Gilles. The Americans had finally made it to more open ground. The next day, Adolf Hitler, deciding there would be no invasion at the Pas de Calais, released part of the powerful 15th Army to von Kluge to stop the American drive. It was too late. There was no longer any doubt. The German line had definitely been penetrated. And Collins didn't stop there. He sensed the German army, while still capable of putting up a fight, had lost control of the battlefield and ordered the advance to continue. Picking up speed as it went, the American offensive pressed ahead through the crumbling German defenses. By July 27th, complete breakout from the Normandy beaches had been achieved. The Allies drove 25 miles deeper into the German lines over the next 36 hours and approached Avranches. The Americans were finally in the open.
By that time, we was getting up into Hill 122, Hill 112, and we were getting observation back at them now instead of them, you know, having all the observation there.
And that's basically what ends the Normandy campaign. The U.S. breakout at Cobra near the city of Saint-Lô is what ends the campaign. Patton's Third Army goes racing into Brittany to seize the Breton ports, and the First Army continues to push out towards Paris. Eventually what this will lead to is the race to the Seine River, the Falaise encirclement of the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS later in the summer, later in July and in early August, and basically the end of the German defenses in France.
Field Marshal von Kluge sent an urgent message to Hitler that his left flank had collapsed. American armor had ripped open the front. Unbeknownst to von Kluge or the Fuhrer, it was about to get much worse. By the 1st of August, the 4th Armored Division had secured Avranches, taken Pontauban, and captured a bridge intact. General George Patton's 3rd U.S. Army was activated and, wasting no time, moved 7 divisions through the narrow corridor seized by Collins' troops. The 3rd Army's columns rampaged into Brittany.
George Patton, I don't think, was ever happier than when he was just running as fast as he could. As soon as George Patton broke out, I mean, he immediately sent the Third Army racing up into the Brittany Peninsula. And he was, I mean, you can read in his correspondence, he was just happy as could be because he was out in the open running. And as it dawned on the Allied command that really the battle was not going to be in Brittany, it was going to be on the Seine River, that the Germans were in much worse shape than we thought they were. And that in fact it was time to push to the east, not to the west. Bradley told Patton to turn his guys around and come back the other way, and not a murmur from Patton. I mean, he was happy to do it because he was running in a different direction, but he was still running flat out.
We were pulled aside and the Third Army came through with, called him Patton and his killers.
Patton's Third Army pours through the gap, turns west, and goes into Brittany to try to take the fortified ports. Unfortunately, a large portion of his available infantry and armor gets tied down trying to take these objectives.
Word comes down, mount up, we're going to the Brittany Peninsula, the port of Brest. Here we moved into the prime submarine base for the whole German Atlantic Fleet. They were dug in. They had a parachute division. They're ready to fight anything to try to take that port away from them. The 29th was there, I think the 8th Division was there, and the 2nd, there were 3 divisions involved. And It was tough fighting. It was almost as tough as trying to get down the beach.
One of the toughest objectives probably was at Brest, at the Fort Monterey there. After we had secured the fort, then during the night it was lost because the Germans from Brest could come up some way, came up through there, and they wiped out a number of the men.
The second had begun to clear out the city of Brest, which was the first difficult city fighting because they were heavily built buildings, and you could hit them with a tank round and it wouldn't do a great deal. So they had their challenges. We had, on the northern part of the periphery, we had the French forts to worry about, and they were massive affairs that had long-range artillery, naval artillery.
And particularly at Brest, we got strung out so that at times I only knew where the men were that I placed them because we had to cover a long frontage because of losses there. And when the Germans were sent 3 or 4 people under the truce white flag to surrender, they came through my company as they walked to the rear.
Fighting for the Brittany ports will go on well past the fall of Paris. But the fact that a significant part of his army is tied up in this conflict on the coast doesn't stop General Patton from continuing the breakout of the Third Army.
As the Allies were breaking open the Normandy front, on the Germans' eastern front, the Red Army arrived just across the Vistula River from Warsaw. This prompted the Polish resistance movement, without coordinating with the Soviets, to begin an uprising. An SS group defeated the revolt in 2 months of house-to-house fighting and left Warsaw devastated.
Such terrible damage had been done to the German army in the east that resources had to be sent there to firm up the front. And these resources could not be sent to Normandy to firm up the front there. Germany was caught in the two-front war that its military had always dreaded, and disaster was looming.
As Patton's drive entered Brittany, Hitler ordered von Kluge to retake Avranches and cut off the American spearhead. The field marshal responded that such an attack was beyond the capability of his forces. Hitler then sent a personal emissary to von Kluge's headquarters to observe. The field marshal knew he was now suspect. On the 4th of August, Hitler sent a detailed battle plan to von Kluge and again ordered an attack, leaving von Kluge no choice.
When the U.S. Third Army broke out, the breakout route was a fairly narrow corridor along the coast. And it doesn't take a genius to look at a map and say, you know, a narrow corridor is perhaps susceptible to being cut off. And Hitler wasn't a genius, but he saw this, and so he ordered Panzer Group West to assemble whatever armored divisions it could and to throw everything into a counterattack to cut that corridor. This was called the Mortain counteroffensive.
The success of the German attack was compromised from the outset. 2 days before the attack began, Ultra, the British code-breaking operation, had alerted Montgomery and Bradley to the movement of panzer divisions westward. General Bradley was able to reposition the forces from the 7th Corps to meet the panzer's assault.
They took the artillery and the infantry and everything, and they went in and fought the regular counterattack.
Germans thought they could drive through there with all their tanks and everything and cut off the supply for the American army from the peninsula, from the coast. But what they didn't know was we were there and we stopped what they're trying to do. Mortain was sort of a place that was in hilly country, not mountainous, but hilly country. And so set your guns up. My gun was set on a crossroad, and the whole platoon was spread across it.
Had the German tanks and infantry succeeded in breaking through at Mortain, the Allied troops beyond that point would have been in a serious predicament. The main Nazi assault was centered on a 5-mile front between Mortain and Sourdebelle, which was defended by 2 American divisions. Throwing 6 battered mobile divisions into the battle, they achieved some success.
They overran our other guns. They killed about 5 or 6 people. They captured the lieutenant who was in charge of our 3rd platoon.
Recognizing the seriousness of the situation, infantrymen of the foremost battalions had dug in on higher ground overlooking Mortain.
There was one FO set up in the classic church tower position on top of a hill, beautiful field of fire. And he had 1 battalion, the German attack started. Within an hour, he was calling down the entire Corps artillery.
With the artillery fire came air attacks by the Allied Air Force against the enemy offensive. Medium bombers struck all day at German movement on the roads to the front, while tactical fighters engaged targets of opportunity. They flew hundreds of sorties, and the Germans could do little to stop them. The sustained assault took a terrible toll on the attacking panzer divisions. The Americans made an incredible stand. They lost over 50% of their strength, but held off the Germans.
The attack is a fiasco. The Mortain counteroffensive is stopped in its tracks. It hardly makes any advance at all, and it stopped within a day.
As the German attack moves into the 2nd day, General Patton, who's being threatened by this German force to be cut off, ignores that and continues to position his forces to threaten Le Mans. Should he be able to take Le Mans, he will be in a perfect position to swing in behind von Klug's forces and threaten them.
Field Marshal von Klug recognized the danger to his mobile forces and recommended falling back to defensible terrain. Hitler refused to hear any discussion of retreat and ordered the continuation of the attack.
The combination of that attack going to the west and Patton's breakout to the east, of course, meant that almost all that German armor was now susceptible to being cut off by Patton turning north and the British coming south out of their bridgehead. And the place where they would have met is a place called Falaise.
To the north, the Canadian First Army was preparing to make their advance on Falaise. On August 7th, the orders went out. That night, infantry and tanks would ride south as an armored phalanx, following a path cleared by Allied air power. Following the order to move out, the ground attack started. Searchlight beams bounced off low clouds to bathe the field in artificial moonlight. The weight of the bombardment and the force of the tank infantry assault gained the Canadians 3 miles during the hours of darkness. At dawn of August 8th, the troops were through the main line of German defense. But while they had made a deep penetration and the road to Falaise seemingly lay open, more groups of SS Panzers appeared, and the advance ground to a halt. 3 days after it began, the attack was spent. The Canadians had won 9 miles, but could go no farther. The Germans were still astride Route Nationale, number 158, the bloody road to Falaise. Meanwhile, the 3rd U.S. Army had taken Le Mans and turned north to close the pocket by linking up with the British.
We were greeted like kings as we went through on trucks and so on, and we stopped, and people would put flowers in our helmets and all this sort of thing. And the French were very glad, of course, to be liberated.
By the night of August 13th, the American 15th Corps was on the outskirts of Argentan. They were certain they could reach Falaise and link up with the Canadians who had stalled on their drive from the north. Together, they could prevent the escape of German forces in Normandy through the gap that remained between the two Allied forces. Bradley felt that the Germans inside the pocket were about to stampede through the Argentan-Falaise gap, and American troops driving toward Falaise might be overrun. In one of the most controversial orders of the war, General Bradley told General Hayslip, commander of the 15th Corps, to hold his position. Bradley preferred what he termed a solid shoulder at Argentan to a broken neck at Falaise. Almost the entire German mobile force in the west lay within the Falaise-Argentan pocket, but it was a pocket with a hole.
In fact, the pocket was never completely sealed. You know, you can blame Montgomery for not pushing hard enough, and you can blame Bradley for not allowing Patton to go further. I mean, all this time Patton is saying, you know, the British are having a hard time. We've got our objective. We can go further. I mean, you can find lots of people to blame, but I'm not sure what good it does you. I mean, at the end of the day, most of those divisions in the Falaise pocket were chewed up pretty badly.
Bradley later explained that he wanted to avoid a head-on collision between Americans and Canadians that might lead to a fight between friendly forces, and further felt it was necessary to await Montgomery's invitation to begin closing the gap. But no such invitation was forthcoming. Montgomery was sharply criticized by American commanders for his failure to close the Falaise gap. Patton proposed to Bradley, "Let me go on to Falaise, and we'll drive the British back into the sea for another Dunkirk." Montgomery's failure to order Bradley to close the gap may have stemmed from the fact that the Canadians were prepared to resume their attack toward Falaise. That assault came on the 14th of August, a hot summer day in Normandy. The Canadian 3rd Infantry and 4th Armored Divisions were to proceed in as narrow a column as possible. As had become the normal practice, the attack was to be preceded by a massive aerial bombardment. The foot soldiers loaded into armored personnel carriers they called Holy Rollers, and just short of noon, they headed toward the sun and Falaise. The leading tanks flailed the fields for landmines seeded in the ground. The obscuring dust they created and a mix-up in signals confused the supporting aircraft, and Allied bombs fell among Canadian troops. Over 100 were killed and many others injured. When the armored columns entered the enormous dust cloud created by the bombers, they steered for the sun, which showed only as a disk through the haze. Whenever the Canadians pressed hard, they took the ground they needed. The German units within the pocket lay within the range of Allied artillery, and all were vulnerable to air attack. Squadrons of RCAF and British Typhoons pounded the enemy. The battlefield at Falaise was unquestionably one of the greatest killing grounds of any areas of the war. If you had been there that summer, they said, you would always smell death in Normandy. A cloud of decay hung heavy in the hot summer air, and it hung heaviest over the gap.
Oh, talk about a killing ground. A lot of it, of course, was done by the Typhoons.
And bodies all over the place, and dead cows, and the smell was pretty grim too. And like old Eisenhower said, it was the biggest killing ground the world has ever seen, you know. And he said, you know, like he could walk for 100 yards on flesh.
The Canadians entered Falaise on August 16th. The birthplace of William the Conqueror was rubble. The pocket was a cauldron. That night, without Hitler's permission, Field Marshal von Kluge ordered his troops to retreat. Several nights would be needed to get all of them out, if the sides of the pocket could be kept from closing in, and the exit, now only a few miles wide, could be held open. Pounded unmercifully by aerial bombardment, artillery, and armor, the Germans retreated in stunned disorder.
I saw one German Panzer Grenadier walking down the road, and he'd been hitting the legs, and he was staggering along saying, all is kaput, all is kaput. And he was the only survivor in his outfit, you know.
It's just like a shooting gallery, you know. They had no defense. All they were trying to do is get out. But my golly, without seeing it, you can't believe it.
The roads were absolutely jammed tight from one end to the other, the country lanes and the main roads and everything else. I remember walking down one of these lanes, and it was end to end with burnt out lorries and vehicles and things like that. I mean, the driver's still sitting at the seats, you know, holding on to onto the steering wheel with the back of the head blown out, type of thing. You know, I mean, this is one specific thing that I remember quite clearly. It was a killing field, there was no question about it.
The commanders desperately tried to save their panzer divisions for a stand at the Seine River. Caught in the giant pinchers between Falaise and Argentan, the Germans suffered heavy casualties. Approximately 10,000 German soldiers died in the Argentan-Falaise pocket. More than 50,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner.
I think the elite forces of the German army that were protecting Normandy were pretty well destroyed in the Falaise Gap, although there were others that did make their way back to Germany.
The Falaise pocket did really chew up the German army in the West. It wrecked the German army in the West, and it wasn't until later in the year that they were able to build a new army when they retreated back to the Siegfried Line.
Von Klug would never live to see this. He was disgraced and relieved of command, and en route to Germany, he committed suicide. In his place, Field Marshal Model, who was a very experienced commander from the Eastern Front, takes over the situation, and it was a situation that bordered on complete chaos.
While the Battle of the Falaise-Argentan pocket still raged, on the 15th of August, U.S. and French forces landed in the south of France in Operation Anvil. This invasion was seen, among other objectives, as a way to redeploy American and Free French forces from the Mediterranean into the main fight for the approaches to Germany itself. The U.S. 7th Army, commanded by General Alexander Patch, was designated to make the invasion. It consisted of the 6th U.S. Corps and the 2nd Free French Corps.
One of the most interesting aspects of the invasion of southern France was the coalition nature of the attack. A major coalition partner in the invasion of southern France was actually a French army. And within a few months of that invasion, there is a French field army in the line fighting against the Germans. A development that few Americans are aware of, but the French did participate significantly in the liberation of their own country.
Airborne and Special Operations Forces preceded the invasion itself. The 1st Special Service Force, an elite U.S.-Canadian commando unit, landed by rubber boat on some small offshore islands that covered the approaches to the beaches.
One of our jobs there was to knock out these large guns that were there according to the aerial photos, and so that when the troops landed in southern France that they wouldn't be cut up. We went in there and found out when we got up on the top that those large guns were really wooden guns. And that wasn't the only time that wooden guns replaced real ones.
The airborne and glider-borne forces landed at first light, blocking routes to the beaches and causing confusion for the Germans. As in Normandy, they faced many obstacles.
Actually, the combat part was a piece of cake. We didn't really encounter any action at all. The landing was tough because, well, our briefing didn't turn out to be the way it was supposed to be. So the fellow I was flying with, we landed in a grape vineyard. Tore up the glider pretty bad, but didn't hurt anybody.
Quite a few of the glider pilots were killed, and quite a few men were killed when those things came in, because there's no control at all of them. For paratroops and gliders both, they had these 6 to 8 inch round peeled poles, sharpened on top, and they were about I'm going to say close to 6 feet tall, that the Germans had buried, not in a pattern, So no matter which direction you came, there was no way to go down between them.
The U.S. 6th Corps made the assault on the beaches near Cannes. They faced little opposition from the few demoralized Germans who had already begun withdrawing from the area. The Americans suffered fewer than 200 battle casualties.
So we landed in southern France. The 1st and 2nd battalions of the 3rd Division were to go in first and make the initial landing, and we were to follow them in.
We hit the southern France beaches, and the beaches were pretty heavily fortified and mined. And a very comforting thing was happening. Our cruisers were out 4 or 5 miles in the water lobbing heavy shells along the German fortifications along those beaches, and you could see with the binoculars things being knocked out, which would make it easier.
Once the beachhead was established, the French 2nd Corps turned west to capture the ports of Toulon and Marseille. In the process, they cleared the area of Germans. Meanwhile, the U.S. forces drove up the Rhone Valley along the coast to the foothills of the Alps.
We took several places there, liberating these people in the hills. And there's a place called Vence and Caen and just numerous small towns that we went through. We had the French people with us, and the French forces of the interior, the FFI and the Maquis, they were there helping wherever they could, but most of it was the force going through and chasing the Germans over into the Italian side at that point. We ended up on the Franco-Italian border then, but what you'd call the Côte d'Azur area. And they call that the Champagne campaign because of the fact that it wasn't quite as rough as the Italian campaign, because we had air power by that time and so forth that we didn't have in the Italian situation.
The drive up the Rhone Valley was a model of mobile fighting. General Truscott's men, advancing in parallel columns on both sides of the river, made every effort to cut off the German 19th Army under General Friedrich Weiss, which fell back in considerable disorder.
Pushed right up through the Rhone Valley to Lyon in no time. Very well organized advance. Even though the Germans were retreating at the time, they potentially could have held them up and weren't able to.
Only a well-handled rear guard action saved the remnants of the German army from destruction at the Battle of Mont-le-Mort. As the American ring closed in on the escape route, the 11th Panzer counterattacked and threw back the U.S. 36th Infantry Division. In a repeat of the Falaise-Argentan battle, the Panzers held the road open, while the rest of the army tried to escape.
The destruction was really devastating. It totally plugged the road for about 10 miles north of Mont-le-Mort. And so we had to make our road by a bulldozer out alongside the highway.
In 2 weeks of running battle, General Truscott's units had virtually annihilated the German forces in southern France. The 7th Army was well positioned to be part of a double envelopment of all German forces west of the Rhine River. While Truscott's men chased the Germans up the Rhone Valley, in Normandy, the closing of the Falaise-Argentan Gap signaled the collapse of German resistance in western France. The British drove across the Seine River and into the area of Pas-de-Calais, making up for lost time as they raced through western France.
The German collapse is pretty much complete in France, and it was just a question of how fast the Allies could get across France to liberate Paris and as much of the rest of Europe as possible.
Designed for as a cruiser tank. And we outrun wireless communication with divisional headquarters because we traveled up so fast. Any opposition we came up against, we just went round. The idea being to move as fast as we possibly could.
The British Army has overrun a great deal of France, and they're well on their way to Belgium. Meanwhile, General Bradley's 12th Army Group is headed towards the Seine River and Germany's border. And it's during this pursuit phase that the German High Command realizes two things. First of all, American divisions are motorized to a scale well beyond anything that they have met to this point in the war. And the second thing is that the American Army is displaying an aggressiveness that matches this motorization.
German infantry divisions reliant on horse transportation were outmaneuvered and run into the ground. The result was complete demoralization of the retreating German forces.
We were on one highway going towards the Siegfried Line, and we noticed off to the right, about 5 miles off to our right, that our planes were bombing and strafing a German convoy. The Germans were over there trying to get to the Siegfried Line before we did. And it turned out that they lost a lot of men and equipment in the bombing and strafing. And we advanced real fast and got around in front of the Germans and headed them off.
Von Mellenthin, who had been fighting in the Eastern Front and arrived as a staff officer just as they were reaching the German border. And his comment that in the East, German divisions are coming back extremely weak, but they were roughly intact. As long as they weren't right in front of a Soviet tank army, they kind of got out of the way and retreated. So they weren't coming back intact. They were just getting remnants coming out of France because the Americans were overrunning everything. And division commands and division rear areas and all the support troops were just evaporating. They were either being captured or overrun, and this just shocked him because he thought it was much worse in the Eastern Front and hadn't realized that against an army that's superior in mobility, you lose everything.
When it became apparent that our forces were moving east, German units in places like Bordeaux and Toulouse and so on in southern France started to head northeast, hopefully to get back to Germany before we closed them off. One of our second lieutenants, who was in what we call an I&R platoon, it's intelligence and reconnaissance platoon, took a Jeep and drove, several hundred miles south. There was nothing. Finally, he encountered over 20,000 German troops and was able to talk the German general into surrendering.
All of this allowed the Allies to take advantage of a month of relatively unchallenged exploitation as they raced for the Rhine. Following D-Day, the invasion had fallen far behind schedule. Yet as the end of August approached, the Allied Army's advance had far outstripped the expectations of Eisenhower and his staff.
It shows one thing the American Army does very well, which is improvise, because it was never planned. The strategic planning was to be approximately at the line of the Seine River by Christmas. And instead, once they saw a chance to make a breakout, we went ahead and did it.
All that held the Allies back now was a continued inability to keep pace logistically with the race across France. This was a problem that would continue to plague the Allies long after the liberation of Paris, and ultimately fell to General Eisenhower to solve.
They'd run beyond the range of effective truck support from Normandy, and the French railroads had not yet been repaired and reopened.
Eisenhower chose to go with a broad front strategy, and he's been criticized about this repeatedly in the years that followed, not only at the time, but historians and experts in military history wonder whether it wouldn't have been wiser to put those limited resources available behind just one army so that it could cut across France into Germany as quickly as possible and maybe end the war sooner.
To help ease the resupply problem, dedicated trucks and drivers were used to form a supply chain that would come to be known as the Red Ball Express.
They'd have a red ball, and that's all they had for a marking. And the quartermaster or whoever was driving the trucks, they would follow these red balls, and they would be right up there with wherever they were needed.
One of the aspects of Army logistics in the European theater, and the Red Ball Express specifically, is that the vast majority of the work being done was being done by colored troops. Now, these are black soldiers who were segregated by the Army's policies from being unable to perform combat duties. They were given the burden of moving the logistics forward. And without these black soldiers, the Army's campaign in Europe would have faltered.
Despite the forming of the Red Ball Express, resupply issues would plague the Allies well beyond the liberation of Paris. While the First Army approached the capital, General Patton's Third Army was already beyond Paris and closing on the German border, their advance slowed by fuel shortages. Bradley had hoped to avoid a direct attack on the City of Light, wishing to exploit further east rather than take on the liberation of a large metropolitan area. However, as the Allies advanced, the French resistance rose in revolt, forcing a change in Bradley's plans. Similarly to Warsaw, the French resistance didn't coordinate their actions in Paris with the Allied advance. Instead, they rose up spontaneously against the German occupiers, intent now only on withdrawing. Sporadic fighting spread throughout the city. Fearing that the resistance fighters would be defeated, the Allied forces moved toward the capital. And in a symbolic gesture, the Free French were allowed to enter the capital first. The 2nd Free French Armored Division led the U.S. 5th Corps into the City of Light on the 25th of August, 1944. The presence of Allied units in Paris did not immediately stop the fighting.
And we were going to stop near the Arc of Triumph, and the Germans opened fire across the way. So the FFI took off and left us, and so we got the hell out of there.
Eventually, the trapped Germans laid down their arms and surrendered to the Allies. Many German officers and men were brought into the Free French headquarters to become prisoners of war. As the capital was pacified, it was a euphoric time, and some predicted the imminent fall of the Nazi state. An Allied victory parade made its way down the streets of Paris.
It took us about 10 hours to get through Paris, down through the Arc of Triumph, the Champs-Élysées. The French people were so happy, so jubilant to be liberated after 4.5 years. Many of them, especially the women, the young girls, would run out and give the troops wine, calvados, bread, cookies.
France was again free. On Saturday, August 6th, the people of Paris paid homage to the greatest hero of the French resistance, Charles de Gaulle, who would go on to become head of the French post-war government. With the Western Allies and the Soviets driving hard for the German borders, there was a widespread feeling that it would all be over before Christmas. However, many more months of fighting lay ahead, before the Allies' ultimate victory. "60 years later, it's difficult to imagine these quiet beaches and fields were a battlefield on which hundreds of thousands of men and women fought and died. The distant conflict is now only marked by abandoned fortifications and monuments. But it will always live on in the hearts and minds of those who fought there.
I did go back to Normandy 2 years ago. I wanted to go mainly to the cemetery because there were fellows in my outfit who are buried there. And it's quite an impressive place. I was very impressed with the way that you can find a grave if you know the person. I had a list of names that fellows that I recalled had died in Normandy. And he just went on the computer and write down, and he gave me the location of every grave. I hate to say it's a beautiful place, hesitate to say it's a beautiful place, but certainly a very impressive place.
We went back to Utah Beach, and it was difficult, really, to try to retrace your steps, how you came up the beach and up. It was a little difficult, but the gun emplacements were still there, and then they have a museum there, near there, of how the waterfront looked, and that was a rather moving experience to go back and see that.
The first time back was '88. We dedicated the 29th Division monument in Vierville, and before we went out there, I fortified myself with a bottle of wine. And I went out there, and it still cracked me up because I was seeing things that the average person didn't see.
Everybody's got their own story to tell, and everyone is different. And as they say, if they say they wasn't scared.
Recently, people around me have implied that I'm something of a hero. Was I a hero? No, but I was surrounded by people who were.